Welcome to the Stewart Squared Podcast. Today we've got a fun talking point about science fiction and the history of the personal computer and how it relates today and all the sci-fi moments. What brought this up is my dad is in New York and he is going to go grab some cyborg-like hearing aids that are turning the AirPods are turning into hearing aids. And so now I'm curious about what it felt like when the personal computer showed up. And I was actually talking about somebody with this yesterday, an older gentleman who's a doctor who first started using WordPerfect, and they had a pirated copy out of Orem, Utah, of WordPerfect in order so that he could do his doctor stuff on WordPerfect. So it must have been a sci-fi moment, but was there one moment where the computer was like there and they were like, oh wow, this is big? It's from our previous discussion. It sounds like the internet was that, like the browser was that.
So you're talking, the way I put it is, these are mind-blowing moments where I can't believe what's going on. And my first mind-blowing moment was, I'd heard about the Apple II and this program called VisiCalc, and I actually met the people that developed it before I used it. But I went and bought an Apple II with a copy of VisiCalc, and set it up on my dining room table. This was pre your arrival, in late 1979, and it had a green screen monitor. We're looking at each other, and this is graphical, and they didn't have that on the Apple II. It was just a TV screen with green characters that would go across. And they were able to represent the spreadsheet kind of graphically, but it was all in green. And so I set it up and I started playing with VisiCalc, and I'm going, I knew enough at the time to know how you did forecasting or modeling or simulation for a business. I knew what a P&L was. And here I could just change everything. And I'd hit recalc and it would recalculate. I didn't need to write all this stuff out or get a calculator. That was mind blowing. And part of the experience, and there was a fellow named Jean-Louis Gasset who worked at Apple at the time, but afterwards recalled it as it was actually like a game that you could sit there and go, okay, these are my assumptions. And then you would change your assumptions and you'd go repeatedly. And it's very much like other mind-blowing experiences in my computing history where it turns something that's drudgery into like a game and makes it more fun, more productive, obviously. But that was the first mind-blowing experience I've had. And I've had a bunch of them. Some of them are kind of weird. I'll give you a completely orthogonal example. People have started using the word orthogonal. Do you know what it means?
I do. Well, I hope I do.
Tell me what it means.
Yeah, it means so we're going one direction and then you're going to go a whole other perpendicular direction somewhere else.
It's not quite perpendicular.
Okay.
It's ironic. It gets wider as time goes on.
I like it. Okay.
And I was recalling this because Bob Frankston was the guy that programmed VisiCalc. And in my very first conversation with him, he used the word orthogonal. And I remember writing it down in my notepad because I went, what the heck is this orthogonal thing? So I then had to go look it up in a book because we didn't have everything on computers then. But then I've used it, and a lot of people are using it now because our political situation is kind of orthogonal.
It is that, but wait, I want to go back. What was the orthogonal mind-blowing experience? Yeah.
So let's see, what was I going to talk about? I fly a lot, and I have my preferences. And for what it was 43 years, I lived in San Francisco, which is a United hub. And the norm with United was everybody would sit around and go, God damn United. It's like always, they're unfriendly, even though they say they're the friendly skies and all this kind of stuff. And most recently, in the last 9 months, they upgraded their systems. And their app now is remarkable, truly remarkable. It basically tells you where the airplane's coming from that you're supposed to get on. It tells you if it's late, tells you why it's late, so you can assess the risk of it. They basically changed essentially the whole culture of United Airlines because they redid the IT systems and they organized it around your frequent flyer numbers. So you can check in for your ticket, or you can check into the United Mileage Plus Club or whatever it's called, United Club. Everything is based around that number. So they know who you are all the time, and they know what you're doing, and it's all in real time.
Yeah.
And it's like a pretty remarkable experience. But they've also retrained their people, right? So the pilots tell you what's going on when you're on the airplane, and the flight attendants know what's going on, right? They used to just say, well, I don't know. But now they know, right? And they're all using the same mobile phones we're using. They're using the same app. It's like an incredible change. And we flew on American here to New York, and we were hit by a snowstorm. American could not tell us what was going on. Even when we called, the guy on the phone didn't know what was going on. I knew more than they did because I was sitting there and it was snowing. It's like United has used technology to differentiate the experience of flying on that airline. That's orthogonal to our conversation, but it's mind-blowing. And it's, I know enough about how companies operate. This is United Airlines. They went bankrupt. They've been through all these experiences. And somebody, maybe the CEO, maybe the chief technology officer, has created a change in culture, which is really hard to do.
Yeah. Well, there's like 12 different talking points. We can go from there. Let's go with the least or maybe the most orthogonal. But information, it sounds like there are many ways that things can get sci-fi. Most people think, or mind-blowing, that most people think that it's essentially something technology related, and it is technology related, but it's information related. When you're talking about the green screen for the VisiCalc, it reminded me of the movie The Matrix. And The Matrix, of course, is based on the simulation theory, which talks about life being like a game. But we, not to go too far into that. And a lot of people have ideas about technology and the Matrix. But what you just mentioned was a information organization way, but information and culture organization inside of or the information and culture, the way that they work inside of an organization to provide the customer with a better experience that also leads to a mind-blowing experience. Goes back to our previous conversation on the experience economy. And so there's now two. Go for it.
You want me to try to tie this together?
Yeah, go for it.
The technology only enables. Technology itself doesn't do anything. It only enables somebody who knows how to use it, whether it's an individual or an organization. Yeah. So technology inherently doesn't actually do anything. And this is what's very interesting about AI, because everybody's thinking, oh, AI is going to start doing it, right? Regardless of whether we want to do it. And we still rule human beings. And maybe that'll change at some point. But the debate about AI right now is, what does it really enable? And so people think it's like magic. It's passed the Turing test. It's like, it's operating on its own. It's not, in particular, because produce the benefit. This is what I've talked about before with the batch processing. They have to go out and they build the LLM, and it takes them 6 to 9 months and billions of dollars, and then they put it out, and it's still 6 months old. Can't capture anything in real time. And so it's enabling things that some people really value, like it'll help you write, or you can make images, or so on and so forth. But this is not really core to what we do. These things are useful, but not life-changing.
And it's not. It does enable something, and it enables creativity. It enables prototyping, these are very early. It's like the stage of what we're talking about in a business, particularly. Like it doesn't help United. It doesn't help that random person in United learn about the culture in this way from the CTO or CEO. It does help maybe the CTO. I imagine they weren't using AI, but it may help them think about it, because he'll do a simulated conversation on, oh, I've got to, I'm going to make this big change at United, and have a conversation back and forth. So it helps at this initial creativity phase, and it does enable humans to do that. It enables people to talk with languages. It's enabled me to have a conversation with Russian people when I didn't speak enough Russian, and I pulled out my ChatGPT advanced mode, and it allowed me to have a conversation with them. So there are these, but I do agree with you that it's not enabling businesses in the same way that the hype said it would enable businesses. But a key question, will it be able to have its own autonomy and make its own decisions? And what does that even mean? Because I don't think when people talk about autonomy, they talk about a lot of things wrapped up in that word. Nobody really knows what they're talking about when they're talking about autonomy. That feels like it's not going to get around. Like it doesn't feel like we're getting there anytime soon, and it doesn't feel like we actually know what we're talking about, what it means when autonomy. But that's the big fantasy, the scare. OpenAI and particularly Anthropic are basically raising money with and capturing the best AI researchers into their company by promoting this idea that we need to do this in a safe way because otherwise this technology is going to go off and destroy us all. But the story stops there. They never connected between how does it actually destroy us? How does it take control and destroy us? And I think that's an important part. And that is definitely a sci-fi. If you have anything to respond to that, please respond. Otherwise, let's go back and track all the different mind-blowing experiences.
Yeah, let's go there.
Yeah,
let's go there. I'm tired of talking about the dangers of AI because I don't think it's that dangerous yet.
Maybe
so the first one you mentioned, WordPerfect, before we started talking, and WordPerfect never blew my mind because I had used something called ATEX systems, which is a mini computer system for doing text processing for publications. And the first publication I worked at IDG in 1979 had an ATEX system. IDG had standardized on ATEX. And so you had a terminal and you had a huge keyboard and you could whale away at it. It was very good for writing fast. And so when WordPerfect came out, it looked just like that. It was like, it wasn't a copy of ATEX, but you had all these very specialized commands and it was on a PC and you could hit function keys and control your document. I never learned how to use it. Never blew my mind. I started using Microsoft Word on the Macintosh as my first word processing program, and which was a different experience and much later. So that was not a mind-blowing experience. My second mind-blowing, I have to think about this, make sure I'm saying right, because I went Apple II and the IBM PC came out. But my second mind-blowing experience was browsing the internet.
Yeah, okay.
With Mozilla.
So there was basically
browser
and that was 95.
For me.
94. Okay. So 94,
95 is when people started generally using it. Yeah.
Yep. And so that's a big gap. That feels like a really big gap to go from 1979. Well, then there's the printer, but we were talking before that the printer that was
printer was okay. Okay, there you go. The printer was somewhat mind-blowing. I started writing my newsletter in January of 1985. And in January of 1985, the laser printer had just been introduced and was useful, but the software hadn't caught up with it. And so when I started my newsletter in January of 85, I got a pre-release copy of Aldus PageMaker. And Aldus PageMaker had been designed to allow you to compose graphical pages, to do layout. It was the beginning of desktop publishing. You had to have the Macintosh, you had to have the laser writer, and you had to have Aldus PageMaker. But it hadn't been released yet. And I'm sitting there on a Macintosh 512K, no hard disk. It's all on floppy disks. And the PageMaker program came on 4 floppy disks by itself. So in order to use the program, you had to swap floppy disks, but depending on what you were doing.
Oh, God.
So I'm sitting there like pulling a floppy because there's only one of them, one drive, and swapping the disks out. And half the time the program would crash. So I had to save all the time, which means I had to put the floppy disk with the document in to save it on that disk. It was incredibly painful, and I cannot possibly. Your screen sharing. Oh, 512. Yeah, there it is. It's called the Fat Mac because the original Mac had 128K.
And this is it, right? So if you're listening,
that's it. That's what I was to know. But that's sitting on a hard disk. That's actually a later version because the hard disk is underneath it.
Oh, okay.
It's probably a general computer
Yeah.
500K hard disk, 500 megabyte, no, 5 megabyte hard disk.
512 KB of RAM,
Yeah,
non-upgradable.
yes. Now you couldn't know, you couldn't break the back.
Mm-hmm.
And then the very first hard disk that came out, which was later in 1985, was done by a company in Boston called General Computer, and it was a 5 megabyte hard disk, cost like $2,000. Then you didn't have to swap the floppy disks.
Oh.
Anyways, I'm just sort of painting a picture here because
Yeah.
it was mind blowing what Aldous PageMaker could do, but the actual experience was not mind blowing. But it allowed me to print my newsletter out on my printer, the laser writer, and then I'd paste those on paste boards and take them to the local printer. So it was still, you still had to do a printing press. I had like 500 copies the first few months, and then I'd have to trifold them and stuff in envelopes, and I would paste a label on the envelope. And actually, label printing was not that good. Yeah.
What I'm getting from this conversation is just that there's all this complexity that's been removed from my life, but I didn't even know that complexity existed. And I only get a hint of it when I'm trying to do crypto, when I'm trying to move things from one hard disk to another, or understand what a private wallet or a private key versus a public key is. Like, there's some complexity still. Or there's another example: if I were doing something technical, like if I were an engineer at a space company, then that complexity still exists. But for the consumer, the complexity has been removed from their lives for a lot of things.
For a lot of things, but not totally. You still have to deal with printers, and printers are still mechanical and still fail all the time. But I have got in my life, I almost never have to print anything.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
And we were talking about, because there's two sides of it. One is, if you have a printed document, how do you make it digital? So you have to scan it. If you have a digital document, how do you make it print? The need to print is going away over time. And it will take a long time, because like institutions like banks and stuff are really used to having paper.
Yeah, this is a great talking point, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, which is, I imagine you have a lot of your writings saved from the 1970s and the 1980s. Maybe you don't, but I'm no. So my impression, like growing up, we always thought, okay, we'll do things digital. I'll write things digital. And because it's digital, it will be better than it will be in paper, because paper goes away, digital doesn't go away. That turned out to be totally false. That a hard drive goes away much easier than paper. Paper gets burned every 100 years or something like that. You have freak accidents, but it's actually the default that things digitally will go away, because somebody turns off the server, the business no longer runs. Like,
or more fundamentally, the formats change. I wrote on Medium for a few years. Now I'm on Substack. Before Medium, I had a blog post. I don't even remember what it was, and I've lost all that. I don't have it. I can't find it. Maybe on the Internet Archive I could find copies. But even writing my Fortune column from 96 to 2003, go try to find
we've tried
Fortune columns on fortune.com. That's still a magazine and still published, but they didn't know what they were doing back then. And so there is not a perfect archive of my columns from Fortune. I actually have a copy of all of them, so I can scan them at some point. And as you know, I'm trying to do that with your grandfather's stuff too. The problem in technology is it keeps shifting. It's not that it's not permanent. It is theoretically permanent, but it keeps shifting. So you don't know how to keep the stuff from old formats. And I went box diving. You know why? Because I was trying to find documents, and I found a box full of 3.5-inch floppy disks.
How are you going to get them?
And a bunch of other disks that I can't plug them into anything. I can go to a specialist who has maintained the ability to extract information from old formats, but it's not easy.
And this is a key knowledge management thing. which is an arcane research or an arcane subject to discuss, but for some reason I'm really interested in it, and it's part of the reason I do this podcast as well, because for me it's been a constant battle to try to get around this just legion of bureaucratic paper pushers who require these random pieces of paper. And I don't like to store the paper because I'm on the move. Now I do have a little notebook or a folder that I travel with specifically for important papers, because random institutions ask me for papers, but I can't tell which paper I'm going to need at which time. And so I've become a digital hoarder completely against my will, but the Bay Area is full of them. Like the Internet Archive is full of hoarders, and not only digital hoarders, but also hoarders of technology, the actual physical products themselves as well. Can you talk about hoarding? This is going to get orthogonal. Let's get orthogonal. So it seems like the technology industry is full of autistic people with ADHD, people with sort of divergent mental processes. And so they're different from the norm. And Steve Jobs played into this, the think differently thing. That whole thing was like, and he was very much out there. Everybody's out there. And so can you talk about how that mixes with technology? Why startups bring those type of people? And also maybe some anecdotes about some of the crazy people that you've worked with over the many years?
That's fairly broad.
Yeah.
See where to get started.
Steve Jobs. You can talk about Steve Jobs. Yeah.
Yes, it's a permission to talk about Steve Jobs. But you also mentioned the idea of neurodivergence, which is more and more both acknowledged and recognized and common, or less unusual as time goes by, right? We
maybe we're all neurodivergent.
At some level we are.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are sort of 1% neurodivergent, some people are like 80% neurodivergent. I think I'm a little neurodivergent myself, or whatever you want to call it, which might be why my children tend to be neurodivergent and more than I am. But when I was growing up, there was no concept of neurodivergence. Everybody was considered to be normal.
Well, and I'm getting the sense that there is a role that technology plays as well in the neurodivergence. That there's something about adapting to technology that also encourages either the discovery of neurodivergence in someone or actually making them more neurodivergent.
Anyway, so you wanted me to talk about Steve Jobs, really what you wanted. And perhaps he was neurodivergent, but that's not the way I thought of him. Steve did something, so that there's you know who Brent Schlender is, a good friend, who wrote a book about Steve Jobs called Becoming Steve Jobs, which I recommend if you're into Steve Jobs, because he got to know him very well and he interviewed him a lot and he had tapes. And so he went back and listened to the tapes to write the book. And he realized there was a pattern, which was there's three Steve Jobses. The first Steve Jobs was the bad boy at Apple, came up with Lisa Macintosh, and then got thrown out. And then he started a company called Next, and he tried to build the perfect machine, and it was too perfect. It was too expensive, but it was perfect if you had $10,000 and could put up with the small installed base. And then that was the second Steve Jobs. And the third Steve Jobs is when he came back to Apple. And he'd learned, he'd figured out, and he progressed. And being a human who can evolve and become better over time is pretty remarkable. Maybe that's the key to neurodivergence, that you stay loose and you can figure out how to improve yourself. So when he came back to Apple and introduced the iPod, he became a really good leader and executive, but not by doing it the same way everybody else did it. And he came up with this concept, which I listened to Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, and he knows this and has studied him. and apparently does it at Airbnb. Steve did, I mean, the company, by the time he passed, had at least 10,000 employees or 20. I don't know what the number was. But he would personally choose 100 people out of the company to go to an annual offsite. But it was not the executive staff. There might be an executive or two that went to it. But he chose 100 people out of the 20,000 or whatever that he thought were really special. And they could be programmers, they could be, people in a retail store or whatever. And that created this environment where there was real competition to be one of those people. So it created this motivation in the entire company to outperform, to get Steve's attention, to become, better than everybody else, which incorporated at Apple a culture of performance, which is always the hardest thing to do because you start having rules and blah blah blah.
Yeah, you can't create a culture of performance through rules.
Feels like you're not on my Bluetooth anymore.
You can't create a culture of performance through the establishment of rules.
Yeah. No, my AirPods just, oh, I can't tell.
So you can't create a culture of performance through the establishment of rules. Why is that? Why can't you create a culture of performance? Like, can you talk about the rise of the bureaucracy? I now saw this personally, so I understand it, but it seems like you've seen it a lot where these companies turn into behemoths and something breaks down, and what breaks down? Why can't you do a culture of performance at a large institution?
Okay, so I'll switch people. There's a guy named Reed Hastings who invested and then became CEO of Netflix. And he wrote a book called No Rules, Rules. And he created this essential an experiment at Netflix where he got rid of the rules. Like a lot of the rules are related to like when you can take vacation or filing expense reports or, who reports to whom. So he created an environment where there were no rules. And the intent was to push all the authority down to every employee. So they made their own decisions, right? You could go on vacation anytime you wanted. But if you went on vacation too much, your teammates would go, well, fuck, that guy isn't helping out. So it would eventually lead you to being fired, not because you broke the rules, but because you're not contributing. It's a really fascinating book. And he doesn't run Netflix anymore. Netflix has got a lot more rules. Yeah. Well, there's parts of that culture that are still there, but they're gigantic now. They're worth $300 billion. And, so there's this pressure to normalize in an organization, to treat everybody the same, because, that's kind of how organizations work. And it's, there's people that have observed that it's hard to resist when there's 100 people or 1,000 people or 200,000, but you have to resist it. That's the thing, is you have to resist it. And the only way to resist it is to have a leader who understands that. So you look at companies, like I call this the Southwest effect. You know that, was it last Christmas? Whenever it was, at Southwest melted down in the middle of bad weather. And they melted down because their computer systems were so old that most of it was done manually. And it worked for 20 or 30 years. And so this has created a crisis in the organization where now the investors want to go in and make the company work, right? So there's what do we call it? A buyout fund that's been buying shares. No, it's a different term. But anyway, to force Southwest to change. Well, they're going to use kind of the book and try to figure out how to make Southwest work more like United or whatever. Whereas Southwest was always different. And so the more there's pressure to make Southwest work like any other airline, the less valuable Southwest could be. And it's a real conundrum. And you can observe this in companies. Why United blows my mind. I've been around for 70 years, something like that. Typical airline, but something's happened at United and they're now acting differently. It's a really interesting thing to study this because it's always comes back to leadership, right? Who's in charge of the company and what kind of
Yeah.
rules do they set? What tone do they set? How do they encourage people to be successful and, bind the company together? And I'm a student of this. So
Yeah. Well, I've got a bunch of questions here because um, there's the great man theory. Have you heard of the great man theory of history? The great man theory of history.
I think I've heard, I know what
Basic,
I sort of intuitively know what it
yeah,
means,
yeah.
but
Basically, it's like Peter the Great. Another other example, Stalin, FDR. There's these two competing theories of history that one, it's all emergent. It all just comes from the collective. The great men don't actually matter that much. Then there's the other one that's like they do. Somebody like Elon Musk, somebody like Steve Jobs, they do actually matter. And so one thing that I'm getting from this is that they do matter. The other thing, and relates to leadership, but then, yeah. So, and that gets into evolutionary psychology, going back to our primate nature and how like there's a one person who goes and rules the tribe. But this gets into the other point I wanted to make. Then we've talked about on the show a lot about the Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the United States with the 14th Amendment, which was also the 14th Amendment was the one that freed the slaves, because all of a sudden you had a bunch of slaves who were not citizens of the United States. And then Lincoln freed them. And then all of a sudden they had to like bring them into the United States. And the only way to do that was make them a citizen. At the same time, corporations also became citizens. So corporations became a corporate body that had some of the similar rules as a human being. So there's a corporate body that was created through this legislation. And why I brought that up is it relates to the culture thing. The culture is this thing that includes all of the people inside of it, but it also is a greater than the sum of its parts. So it creates something like an individual. What do you think? Yeah.
you're losing me.
Yeah.
I was thinking while you were saying the emergence of corporations it's actually a legal thing. Corporations are not people. There's a distinction between an organization and a person. But corporations emerged in the 1890s, about 20 or 30 years after the Civil War. So they were not co-terminus, if you will. They didn't happen at the same time. One thing happened, and then the other thing happened, and then things happen. And so there's constantly change happening. So what we're trying to find is what's the common element through all of this, that applies to us as human beings.
I got the history. So, okay. So, modern evolution, the British Companies Act of 1844 formally established limited liability. By the early 20th century, incorporation became readily available through state offices rather than requiring special legislative grants. And corporate law became increasingly liberalized, with Delaware emerging as a preferred state for incorporation by 1899. Now I want to ask it about what is the relationship to the 14th Amendment, because you're right that there are different differences between an individual and a corporation, but there is some sort of connection that happened with that 14th Amendment, which I'm about to get right now if we're faster.
So, and are you on Perplexity or ChatGPT?
On Perplexity, yeah. And I found the specific court case that I was researching yesterday. Santa Clara County in California versus Southern Pacific Railroad in 1886 established that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause applies to corporations. So that's the connection. And you are right that it's later in the 18th century. Chief Justice Waite declared that corporations were entitled to constitutional protections as persons under the 14th Amendment, and that corporations gained the right to equal protection under the law, due process rights, and protection from state discrimination. And this is the crazy thing about our country, is like this happened in a courtroom, and all of a sudden, like this giant republic all starts to institute this change that allows for what we're currently going on. What do you think of all that, Chris?
I don't know. I think
I don't know either. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't. There are distinctions in what rights corporations have versus what people have. And that's probably happened through case law and precedent since that decision. So I'm not sure it still applies because companies, because companies are run by people, right? There's personal liability. And so one of the things that happened most recently is the CEO and the CFO of a company that's publicly held have to personally sign every financial statement. And so that they're personally responsible, not just a corporation, because it used to be that the individuals could hide behind the corporation. And now there's a lot of liability when you make public statements, i.e., like Elon Musk did with
Yeah, interesting.
Tesla.
But this is the beauty of our system, is that it adapts. So like it makes this change with the 14th Amendment. That was a pretty big adaptation. Late 1800s, the 14th Amendment changes to allow corporations to have some of the rights, but it's a laboratory of democracy, so it's still adapting. And that's really the beauty of our system, is that it just continues to adapt no matter what. Whereas like most of the other systems on the planet are now very fragile.
Well, it's a little hard to tell. I'm reading the 14th Amendment.
Yep.
So the 14th Amendment was about citizenship. The case you're talking about was a court case that meant the corporations could be considered. But corporations don't have citizenship, so that's an interesting thing. Because this is the one that said,
yep, it made all the slaves citizens.
Yeah, everybody's a citizen, and everybody's under equal protection of the law related to formerly enslaved Americans. Yeah, so anyway, we're a little off.
Well, let's get back. So, I mean, there's some really interesting
mind-blowing moments.
But yeah, mind-blowing moments. So we got the Lisa 2. Well, was the Lisa 2 a mind-blowing moment, or the Lisa?
No, the Lisa was not, because like the next, it cost $10,000. It was really expensive. Might have not have been 10,000, but it was very expensive. So Lisa was introduced, and Apple tried to sell it, but nobody was buying it because it was too expensive. And meanwhile, Steve Jobs abandoned Lisa, even though it was named after his daughter, and went to the Macintosh and turned the Macintosh into what it was. And that was his lesson from Lisa, was don't make it a really expensive computer. So the first Macintosh, the 128K Mac, was 1995.
Well, wait, but he abandoned Lisa as well. Like the woman.
He did. He left them hanging and went to the Mac Group, which was then a startup. And it wasn't even a startup inside of Apple. It was a little band of people, and the guy who originally envisioned the Macintosh, who nobody will ever remember anymore, including me, had sort of sketched out an idea for the Macintosh. It was not named Macintosh, and Steve came in and took it over, booted him out, put his own team together, and they produced the Mac.
And then any other mind-blowing experiences? So let's track it all the way back. We've got the VisiCalc on the green screen.
So there's probably two kinds of mind-blowing experiences, and ones that get you right away, and ones where you can see that it's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And laser printer was one of those.
Yeah.
So right now, did I send you the Marques Brownlee thing about the snap spectacles and the this is one of those things. Like, everybody knows that eventually they'll be wearing glasses that show you what's going on both in reality and digital, and you can still talk to people, and it's not this VR thing, but it's not here. Like, the development kits from Meta and Snap are geeky looking and heavy and incredibly expensive. But eventually you could see it's going to happen.
And was
that laser rider moment was, oh yeah, I can see this. It's like really frustrating right now, but there's stuff where you can see in advance what's going to happen, and stuff that
surprises you.
You didn't expect it. Yeah.
So was Bluetooth one that surprised everyone, or was Bluetooth one everybody knew it?
One of my claims to my fame, entirely in my own head, is that I can tell you what every acronym stands for. And acronyms are usually designed by committees that are trying to set standards. So the classic one is PCMCIA, which personal computer, PCMC, memory, CIA. Shit, I can't remember the thing. The way I remember it, though, is people can't memorize computer industry acronyms.
Uh-huh.
Somebody, I didn't make that up. Somebody came up with it. Now I can remember PCMCIA because I remember what the joke was about it. Bluetooth is a standard, and it was set
Yeah,
by
okay.
committee, and it took forever to happen. And there were a number of other things that happened before Bluetooth. Now people are actually trying to go beyond Bluetooth, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but because have you ever butted your iPhone to someone
Yeah,
else's?
yeah, AirDrop, NFC.
No, it's not even AirDrop. They have
Oh,
that's using the smart
uh,
chip.
oh,
It
interesting.
actually, if you butt them up right against each other, each person's contact
Yeah.
information, and you can pass it over to the other person.
Okay, I got a very good question that's coming from this. There's the standardization versus customization, which is really interesting. There's these groups, these committees that standardize things after they've been built, then which led me to inside
Or
of a
even worse,
company.
they try to build it, and doesn't work.
Wait, explain that.
Well, PCMCIA was a standard set by a committee, and which is why the acronym is so hard to remember. But it was a standard for holding a storage in a little, the things that plug in, whatever you call them,
Yeah.
that could store stuff. We don't even use them anymore. So I don't, it kind of came and went pretty quick because, it took forever to set the standard and then the devices moved ahead. But, you carry around those little things and you stick them in a computer and it would show up on any other computer. So you had a little portable storage device.
Whoa. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And
Um,
we don't need that anymore because now we have the internet. You just pass it through the
and the
internet.
committee tried to build it themselves.
Now they tried to design how it should be built.
Oh,
Their manufacturers would all make the same thing.
so the committee got into the design, trying to come up with the design themselves
Technical
rather than
technical
trust.
specifications.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, okay, and this gets to my question because you have somebody like Apple who has their own R&D environment, and their R&D environment is building all this crazy stuff. I saw this one infographic about the three different types of computer board inside the iPhone with all the different things and the supply chain that comes into it. But Apple has these R&D developments that are building all these things, but then at some point they can't build the thing that they need to build, and so that's where startups come in. So startups.
Wait a minute. There's a whole, yeah, I got to stop you here because this is like when the PC was introduced in 1981 by IBM,
Yeah.
they had connectors that were inside. You could take the case off and plug things into it. And there were boards, and some of those boards were like for networking or graphics
Yeah.
or memory expansion or whatever. It was very extensible architecture. However, you had to know how to take the case off the computer and how to plug the board in, and that's pretty geeky.
Yeah.
Um, so that's an open, this question of open systems. Apple
Yeah. Close it.
does everything itself,
Yeah.
down to designing the chips. Now the microprocessors and the chips themselves, all of the different pieces of the chip, they design all of that themselves, and they get TSMC to make them. Right, but Apple doesn't have the technology to make those very small, very highly integrated circuits.
Okay.
TSMC is actually the only one that does now.
That feels like a podcast in itself. Next time I want to focus
Probably.
on how did Apple manage to do that in the way that have they always done that? Was that always Steve Jobs'
No,
part?
no, no. There was a transition. But it was amazing what happened inside of Apple. And probably that's Tim Cook's major accomplishment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Steve
Yeah.
wasn't really good at, and they hadn't gotten far enough, but
Yep.
attempted to complete vertical integration. He was the supply chain guy, and he knew how to do that. And so they took over the ARM. All their chips are designed around the ARM basis.
Did they buy ARM?
No, SoftBank bought ARM, and ARM stands for Advanced Research Machines, and it was a British company started in the 1970s. And I know this because when I went to work at NEA, ARM was a terrible investment. They had invested in ARM, but it was a terrible investment. They'd written it off. And like 30 years later, ARM turned into this architecture that everybody else adopted. Amazon makes chips
Whoa.
based on the ARM, and this has been Intel's big problem is they can't move their architecture onto ARM. They have their own architecture, which is not extensible. Anyways, it's a whole nother podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the next one will be really interesting to go into how, but then specific to that question that I was asking is like the startup comes in, like how did Apple manage to figure out the institutional memory of they decide, oh, we need this random thing. How do we actually learn how to bring that knowledge in-house rather than go and trust TSMC? Because
Go
aren't all
back
the
to
other,
No,
yeah.
they do trust TSMC because TSMC makes the chips. They
Uh-huh.
design, Apple designs them. It's a different part of the process.
Yeah.
And the answer goes back to Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
The thing that Steve could do was to see what people wanted before they knew they wanted it.
Uh,
And he had enough technical chops. He was never a programmer. He was never really a technologist.
yeah.
But he ran the company and he knew everybody in the company. He could make the company do what he thought it should do. And that was true with the Macintosh, even though that took a while to happen. And he saw it with the iPod, which became the iPhone. And, it's like he could see the future and had the confidence and, neurodiversity to make it happen, despite everybody thought he was nuts at the time. He
Yeah,
didn't
that's
care
yeah,
what
yeah,
other people thought about him.
yeah, 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 and that goes back to the Silicon Valley asshole theory.
Yes. Thank you. You remember.
uh, okay, so next time we'll talk about Apple. How did Apple become totally vertically integrated? The relationship with ARM, and then also I want to talk about TSMC and what designing chips actually means because I know that they design chips for people.
Designing. No, they don't.
They
They're designing.
manufacture it. They're a fab.
Foundry is where they make the chips. They have a process for
Yeah.
making chips, which is no one else has reproduced it. They're having a hard time reproducing it themselves because they're building a factory in Arizona,
Yeah.
and they don't think it's measured in nanometers. And so
Yeah.
there's 7 nanometers, which everybody knows how to do. There's 3 nanometers, which a few people have figured out, and there's 2, which TSMC is only one making 2 nanometer,
Wow.
which are in the iPhone 16.
Oh man, so ridiculous. What a weird world. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for this, and we'll see you next week with the Apple.
Okay.